Welcome back to Caracast, the podcast from Carasoft, the trusted government IT solutions provider. Subscribe to get the latest technology updates in the public sector. I'm Corey Baumgartner, your host from the Carasoft production team. On behalf of Juniper Networks, we would like to welcome you to today's podcast, focused around implementing Zero Trust. Government experts explain how to help satisfy federal mandates. Chuck Brooks, president of Brooks Consulting International, Aaron Bishop, CISO at Air Force and Spaceforce, Scott Davis, CISO and Executive Director of Cybersecurity at USDHS Customs and Border Protection, Mitch Herckis, Acting Director of the Office of the Federal CIO and the Executive Office of the President, and Elizabeth Schweinsberg, Digital Service Expert at the U.S. Digital Service, will discuss how organizations can implement Zero Trust to satisfy federal mandates.
Hi, everybody. I'm Chuck Brooks. I'm going to be your moderator today. This is the second in a series from Juniper Federal. The first one we had people from industry, leaders in industry, luminaries discuss the challenges and perspectives of Zero Trust and what it means. And now we're actually going to the second, which looks at the perspective from the federal side. We have a really distinguished panel here today of some of the top CISOs and leaders in cybersecurity in the federal side. And I'm really excited to get into this. So rather than take any more time, I'm going to ask each of our guests to give a little quick background about them. I'll go in alphabetical order. First, we have Aaron Bishop, who is the Chief Information Security Officer for the Air Force and for Spaceforce, and he will be telling you a little bit about his background and profile.
Thanks, Chuck. As Chuck said, I'm the Department of the Air Force's Chief Information Security Officer with purview over both U.S. Air Force and U.S. Space Force. Prior to that, I owned my own cybersecurity research company. And prior to that, I was the CISO at SAIC. Prior to that, I was the general manager for the National Security Group at Microsoft, and then even further industry and experience prior to that. So as you can see, most of my work is in the public sector arena and ranges from both government and industry. So thank you, Chuck.
Thanks, Aaron. And next we have Scott Davis. And Scott is both CISO and Executive Director for Cybersecurity Directorate, Office of Information and Technology at U.S. Customs and Border Protection. And Scott, you want to tell us a little bit about your background?
Thanks, Chuck. Yeah. So since Aaron talked about being with the Air Force and Space Force, I'll start my career when I started with the Air Force. I was fortunate enough to have a 20-plus year career in the Air Force, all of it with IT. I retired in 2008, spent a couple of years as a contracting partner for actually DHS, which I'm now working in. Became a federal civilian back in 2010, and I actually worked for what's now the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. Back when I worked for them, they were the National Protections and Programs Directorate, both of which were a mouthful, all of it doing cybersecurity stuff. Then I went to the Department of Navy for about 9 months and worked then for the Department of Labor for a couple of years as the Deputy CISO. Came over to CBP a couple of years ago and was formally announced as a CISO on September 11th of this year.
Great, thank you. Next, we have Mitch Herckis, who's Acting Director of the Civilian Security Branch within the Office of the Federal Chief Information Officer, which is really OMB, right? And he's one of the leading people involved in implementation of cybersecurity policy in the government. Can you give us a little bit of background, Mitch?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Chuck. So I have been within the Office of the Federal CIO for a year now. I'm serving currently as Director for Federal Cybersecurity, but I came up working with state and local governments on cybersecurity, first from nonprofit organizations, but also for the private sector, as well as having worked for the city of New York within their New York City Cyber Command, which was set up by the mayor by executive order there, and was able to help that team build out that organization. Excited to kind of have the opportunity here to discuss how we are applying some of the Zero Trust work across the federal government here.
Thank you. And Elizabeth Schweinsberg, who is with the U.S. Digital Service, which is an interesting agency because one of the newer ones created in government. And Elizabeth, if you want to tell a little bit about your background.
Yeah, the U.S. Digital Service, we just had our 8th birthday in August. And so I work there. My official title is Digital Services Expert, but my training and prior background is in security engineering. I started in digital forensics for the government, moved into corporate digital forensics and incident response, where I learned a lot about how enterprise networks really get put together. Moved further into adding threat detection underneath that, because it's all one big happy family, and started with the digital service about 2 years ago. I have been detailed to the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services for my entire time. And about a year ago, I started leading their Zero Trust work group put together in response for the executive order. And then we ran CMS's response to the federal Zero Trust security strategy. I also get to work with Mitch and Mitch's office in my role as USDS member on helping shape some of these policies.
Fantastic. I thank you all for your service, and let's dive right into it. The first question for all of you is, how has a Zero Trust mandate impacted federal government agencies' security so far? And what will be the impact for future cybersecurity? I know it's a broad question, but since it's a new initiative, it allows you some time to sort of interpret what it has done so far and where it's going to be going. I'd love to get your insights on that. And I think I'll start out with Scott first on this.
Thanks for that. One thing that the memo did was formalize it. So the term Zero Trust has been around for quite a while, over a decade, but it really formalized it for the federal space and gave us goals and timeline to go for meeting it by FY24. So it put parameters around it, guidelines, mile markers, if you will. Working with CISO, I mentioned them earlier, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. They came out with their Zero Trust architecture, their framework. DoD has their own. They're very, very similar, but a little bit different. But we have the different pillars. And then through the memo, we have, like I said, those mile markers to go with. So we gave us areas of focus, for example, the identity pillar, making sure that the right people have access to the right information at the right time. The data, making sure that the data tagging and the granular level of who should have access to that data, where it should be classified, encryption, all kinds of different things as far as that goes. And then the network, like micro-segmentation. So there's a lot of there's other pillars as well, but I know we've got a little bit of time. We've just got now a roadmap going. And one of the things that we've done within CBP was a gap analysis to find out where we are, because we were leaning forward in a lot of different areas before it was formalized by the OMB memo. For example, the identity and the network micro-segmentation. We already had efforts going towards those. Now we did a gap analysis to see what would it take us to get to check those marks along to the FY24 goal. So those are the activities that we've been doing in CBP.
I mean, it's really great that you did a gap analysis. I think that's really a starting point, should be not just for government, but for anyone involved in business, because there's so many threats out there, and to know what you have connected to you and what data you need to protect is really an important endeavor. Thank you. Aaron, your perspective.
So I agree with Scott completely. I think it's a little different for me in my role in the DAF because of scale. I now have to deal with not only how do these organizations that we have 137 bases around the world, and how do we focus on where do we draw the lines for segmentation of the network? Where do we draw the lines for ICAM? Is it one ring to rule them all kind of thing? Or do we need to start breaking this down a little bit more? So the analysis goes beyond just, are we going to do Zero Trust, but how do we do it at this kind of scale? So that really kind of weighs in heavily on our analysis and when we were doing our gap analysis. Then we also have to look at the operational paradigms, things like, do I sit at home and sortie aircraft from that perspective, or communicate with satellites from that perspective, or do I get into a war footing where I'm doing expeditionary communication, and now I've got to figure out how do I do this on portable technology, or I got to stand up new creation of capability in a place we weren't previously there, and all of a sudden the complexity goes exponential for us.
That makes sense. I've dealt a little bit with satellite security, and that alone, I think, is an area where Zero Trust is critically important, at least some elements of it. And I know that's been one of the areas it's somewhat neglected in the past, because it's mostly industry that's been launching a lot of this. But now you have responsibility for this, and that's we'll get to that later in the discussion. Elizabeth, do you want to weigh in too?
Sure. I'm going to echo some of the same things. So throughout M2209, the Federal Zero Trust Strategy Memo, there's a large emphasis on identity and increasing the trustworthiness of the people logging into government systems through structural password changes. Nobody likes changing their passwords. We should stop making us do it. Improved use of MFA making it more phishing resistant, and generally knowing more about the people and devices that are accessing our systems to the extent that we can. That is going to go a long way to reducing the number of unwanted people on our systems, whether it's internal to a government agency or the services we provide the U.S. public.
Great, thank you. Mitch, I know you're in the same area, but I know your role has been, a lot of us been promoting throughout the agencies and also publicly the importance of the Zero Trust Initiative.
Yeah, no, this is a great conversation. And like to pull on that gap analysis thread, we found every agency had to submit an implementation plan to the Office of Management Budget, to the OFCIO. And, there were about 20 critical implementations that every agency would have to do over a 2-year period under M2209, the federal Zero Trust strategy. And the intention there is for agencies to build a baseline. What we saw off the bat is, a lot of agencies, as was alluded to here, have made significant progress in a lot of different areas already. And this is really kind of able to show, where have they not been able to meet those touch points and how are they going to drive forward? And we got some really great things forward, and agencies are really driving forward. We've been in consistent contact with agencies about their effort. Elizabeth's been one of our allies in ensuring this happens. We have a subject matter expert group. We've had deep dives with every CFO Act agency, and we've been working with a lot of the non-CFO Act agencies as well on their plans. We've seen serious strategic planning moves well beyond just building additional walls and all those sort of things, and really serious thoughts around things like identity, things like how to limit lateral movement through isolating individual environments. So that's been brought up here. There's been a lot of really good conversations, and those are ongoing, and we're launching those into the future as well. We're not just stopping with a one-off. So really excited to see what agencies are doing and reflected in some of this conversation here today.
Yeah, that's really encouraging to hear what you just said, because it appears that there is a lot of activity and involvement up front from these agencies, and they're taking this very seriously. And as most of us know, government doesn't necessarily move slow and is not always the most agile thing, but it appears to be with this initiative in Zero Trust, there is a lot of activity being taken place and a sort of inward look at each agency by CISOs. Aaron, you were starting to talk about some of the challenges. What are the most common strategic and technical challenges that you're facing with your agencies? I guess you could separate Spaceforce from Air Force. What are you seeing, and what do you think needs to happen to overcome some of these challenges and technical maybe roadblocks?
Well, strategically first, I think there's a couple different layers that we're struggling with. And by struggling, I don't mean like there's a showstopper, but challenges that are unique to our size, scale, and mission. We have to plug in with DoD. We have to be able to support a COCOM, and it's not Air Force centric, it's not Space Force centric, it's not DAF centric. It's we're part of a greater fight, and so being able to have that interoperability between Army, Navy, the Fourth Estate, et cetera, is a key aspect of this. So as we build out our stack and our Zero Trust models, we have to make sure we're in alignment with them as well as interoperability. So strategically, that's huge. Strategically, there's also an issue about we don't have one network. We have a lot of networks that we have to manage and be able to move data freely between them for mission purposes, and aggregating different data sets in order to get a full picture of what we are tasked to do. And that causes a whole new level of complication. When we talk about data tagging, we're talking about SD-WANs that are separated. So it makes it very complex. On the tactical and the technical side, ICAM is a beast from a DoD perspective. When you have millions and millions and millions of identity objects just for people, we're not even talking about endpoints, not even talking about all the other things that are on the network. We're only talking about millions of people. It is a hard thing to do, for again that one ring to rule them all kind of mentality. So that interoperability with DISA, DoD, other services is a key piece. But keep in mind, we have mobility. So I may have the lieutenant colonel who's now assigned to a joint billet, and I need to get him out of my world and into the joint world, or over to Navy's world, or to a COCOM, and still be able to reach back and have access to the things he's responsible for, but still be able to see what is in front of him in his joint duty assignment. So as you can see, from a strategic to a technical on both ends, there are lots of challenges to get this right.
Yeah, it makes sense. I mean, the size and complexity of DoD and all these integrated activities with other services really makes it a challenge. Thank you. Scott, what are your thoughts on this from a DHS perspective?
So for good or bad, so CBP is within DHS, so we are following DHS's lead, so we're one of the components within it. So there are some challenges with that because we can't really go our own way. There's some things that we can do on our own, but we are beholden to DHS headquarters and their guidance and their policy as well. Not that that's a technical challenge, but the two that I would add on to that is one is the operational technology. So we think about, the computers, the laptops, the mobile phones, and things like that. But there's a whole other world of operational technology that we have to consider. That's one of the things and we haven't bitten into that apple yet. I think we've gotten some touch points into it, but within CBP, you've got a bunch of folks that are walking around. They've got walkie-talkies. They've got other handheld devices. There's sensors. There's all kinds of cameras. All that operational technology, because 5 years ago, it may not have been on a network. Now we've got to make sure that we've got visibility into it for asset management, for vulnerability management, all these different pieces. So that's one of the technical challenges to truly get to zero trust that we'll be facing, and I'm sure there's others that will be as well. And then the other one that's going to be a very challenging, not technical, but it's the cultural aspect. Cultural within the IT community and then in the user community. We have to teach our own IT people, here's the new paradigm. Lots of folks don't even know what the buzzword of zero trust means. So it's explaining that to our own IT people and then making sure that, because we're going to break a few eggs, it's not going to be the proverbial easy button of what people think, especially at home when they can do things really, really easy. It's harder to do it at work. We have to make sure that there's an education piece and walking them through what zero trust means in their day-to-day work lives. That's going to be another challenge.
Thanks. Yeah, I like the point that you brought up, OT versus IT. I think CISA has now recognized that yesterday that there are actually different processes and capabilities that required for both dealing with it. Just another challenge for everything. But thank you for that perspective from DHS and CBP. It's really interesting. It's what I'm finding too is this is a question for all of you later on. Is it are the budgets enough to do all this? It sounds like it's quite a challenge just to begin with all these different directives you have to follow. I'll start with Elizabeth and go to Mitch on this too, since I know OMB is coordinating a lot of this.
Is any security budget ever really enough? Like, there's always more that we can be doing. It's a little bit awkward here because the timing of the memo was a little out of sync with the budget cycle. So we are having to spend a little bit more time trying to come up with low effort, high return activities that can increase our zero trust maturity, ideally with the tools that we already have, because there's a lot of tools and agencies that just, you need to configure a little differently to really look into it. And then also we need to be showing that our changes are worth it. So going from a phishable two-factor authentication, your SMS, email, authenticator app-based ones to a phishing-resistant MFA requires architectural changes and probably an actual token you have to give out to everybody. So are we collecting the right information up front that we can show the metrics that show how we are actually reducing phishing, not just from yes, this reduces phishing and will save us, to no, look at these phishing attempts that were thwarted because maybe they gave away their password, but they couldn't give away the second factor, and thus no compromise actually happened. So, Mitch?
Yeah, no, I would appreciate Elizabeth kind of mentioning the budget item up front there. We are in budget season here at the Office of Management Budget, so I'll probably refrain a little bit from talking about that in detail. But, I will say, we are trying to build the mechanisms because we understand, going back to that kind of technical challenges point, there's this underlying issue of legacy systems that have kind of held back, not just cybersecurity, but productivity generally for far too long has just been ignored at some agencies, or just hasn't had the budget to fix those things in the past. And that's why we set up the Technology Modernization Fund to kind of provide that vital tool to kind of identify those systemic issues that might be holding back an agency. And that's, not just an issue when it comes to operations, it's an issue when it comes to cybersecurity. You can only bolt on so much, right? You have to kind of occasionally build that underlying foundation that allows you to do the right things, to modernize, to build a modern approach to cybersecurity. We're talking about a fundamental shift in how agencies approach strategically security. And, that's an extraordinary challenge from the get-go. But if you don't have the flexibility in systems or the modern implementations in place, it becomes that much harder. So it's something we're very aware of at the Office of Management and Budget level, and the federal CIO level, and the Executive Office of the President level. And we're thinking of how do we ensure that agencies are getting the right things to move off of those systems and move off of those technical challenges wherever possible.
Yeah, that's not an easy task. It's a lot to do. That's great. Thanks for that overview. I want to move to the next question, which is really an interesting question, because you've seen a lot of investment, I think a huge amount of investment in government go to actually moving from on-prem to cloud to hybrid cloud. And this brings a whole new set of challenges. And so the question is, how do you take a zero trust approach to secure a cloud or hybrid cloud environment when you may not have control of all the data, or you may be sharing some of that with other clouds? And it may be a little bit different in government, but I'd love to get your perspectives on that. And I think we'll start again with Aaron on this.
Wow, that's a fascinating topic that's probably as deep as it is wide. My opinion on zero trust is, going to the culture point that was made earlier is, what is it that we're talking about, right? So, like in the DoD architecture has 7 pillars, and we focus on the user and ICAM, and we focus on endpoint, we focus on network segmentation and SD-WAN, and, there's these different pillars. The key ones in there, of course, are the application. How does it manage those attributes and be able to provide the level of security we want and the access we want? But the data tagging, more importantly, what type of data, who has access and rights to that data, et cetera. So there's a lot of work that has to be done in that space. But what I would argue is zero trust is not a thing. Zero trust isn't a label or certification for a product. Zero trust is a mentality. It's a approach on how you do security baked in from end to end. It just happens to collect it all under 7 pillars or 7 buckets, from that perspective. And if you think of it that way, and you look at cloud from a what is the thing I'm providing from a cloud perspective, then you can start to see which pillars apply and how we want to account for that in the cloud architecture, whether it's, a separate instance in GovCloud, or a hybrid model, partially on-prem, or, any of those combinations. And I think the biggest challenge that we have is working with the existing cloud deployments to see how they backport to this zero trust modality, rather than net new who can follow this prescription and be much more aligned to our zero trust objectives. So I think that's the real issue, is those services that have already deployed, do they meet these mandates? Do they meet the objectives under these pillars? And I would argue that those that don't are going to have the hardest time trying to convert and manipulate to alignment with zero trust. I think that's our biggest challenge.
Great. We'll go back to Mitch on this too, because this is something that you probably have to deal with since it's one of the bigger trends in government. What are your perspectives on with each of these agencies that have different challenges with the cloud? And DoD has its own challenges for sure.
Yeah, and the zero trust strategy was set up in a way that's supposed to be compatible, whether it's on-prem, hybrid, cloud, whatever the case may be. It was set up to build these baselines across whatever, right? As everybody here knows, ensuring policies are consistently implemented gets harder the increasing complexity that you have in place. So when you move to something like hybrid, you're going to need different skill sets for cloud, on-prem, bring those together, ensuring you have all the right people who have all the right skill sets, and also just making sure you're that much better, right? as complexity gets harder. So I would say, if you kind of move towards like, how do you take an approach? There's a lot of different ways to go. What we tried to do is kind of build in some elements that worked with everything. But there's a reason we spent the lion's share of our time on identity. For a reason, it's kind of first among equals, right? And it's treated that way because it's extraordinarily hard to do. And it becomes exceedingly, extremely hard to do unless you are really building a modern, robust, centralized identity solution. And that has to be the first step, whether it's any of those, but particularly when you're building a hybrid cloud solution. That would be kind of my answer to that, I guess. It's a complex question, but
yeah, no, it's a good answer too. That's good. And Scott, do you have anything to add to that?
Sure. So I think, like Mitch was saying, that whether it's on-prem, hybrid, or in cloud, we have to secure it all. So it doesn't really matter. It's part of our jobs as CISOs or security professionals to make sure that it's secure either way. Obviously, there's a whole separate, not separate, but distinct cloud set of controls. But within CBP, we work with different cloud service providers. We also have cloud service providers for example, identity solutions and other solutions that are leveraged via cloud. Part of that is the FedRAMP program, making sure, so they've got their own program that they're working through. And of course, you have to get a certification. And then there's an ongoing assessment with third-party assessment organizations and making sure that within the team that I work with, that we're going through and making sure whether it's physical and in our on-prem, we have to do the same thing. We have to make sure that things are configured correctly, that people are doing the right things. Zero trust means zero trust. Doesn't matter if it's an on-prem or if it's in the cloud, whether it's an employee of CBP or an employee of one of the cloud service providers. It's all of those continual checks. And that's one of the things with identity that we'll be moving forward is not just MFA, multi-factor authentication, but it's continual. So I'm not just plugging in my PIV card or my CAC once, logging in and I'm done. It's continual throughout the day. And that goes whether or not you're a standard user or privileged user. There's differences in those as well. And we're putting things in place to make sure that at all levels, we're checking and checking continually.
Great. Very comprehensive, which is very good to see. It seems that all the elements have been worked out. That's great. Elizabeth, anything to add on this too?
I concur with my learned colleagues. It all starts with identity and works its way down, but it does give us agencies the chance to, as we are upgrading, say going from an on-prem Active Directory to Azure AD or a similar process with a different identity provider, to evaluate tools and find ones that really support the components of zero trust, like the ability to grant least privilege access, to start making other components of zero trust more implementation easier. And we're talking a lot about on-prem traditional, server technology to the cloud, which is a pretty small jump. But I also have another, working at Centers for Medicare, technical challenge around mainframes. Like, what does zero trust even mean for mainframes? There's at least half a dozen agencies that have the same problem, let alone, banking, insurance, airlines. Only the vendors are talking about zero trust for mainframes. And we really need more agnostic sources for this information. That is an area that I look forward to digging into more over time.
That's a good transition to our next question. Obviously, there's the issue with legacy systems, which are a challenge in themselves. What about the new technologies coming along too? You have adversaries out there that have access to machine learning, artificial intelligence, 5G capabilities, and eventually quantum. And so, what do we do in terms of looking at a zero trust paradigm? What do we need to do to fill those gaps to protect against these sort of technological breakthroughs that could certainly imbalance our security capabilities? If they're, the thing about technology is a double-edged sword, is be used for good or for bad. But obviously, some of these gangs are very sophisticated, including using deep fakes and artificial intelligence already for phishing attacks. So I'll go to Aaron on this again. What are your thoughts on these emerging technologies and their impact? And do we need to fill gaps on the next iteration of zero trust to deal with those threats?
So, passionate area of mine, so as you well know. And so one of the challenges that I'm seeing is as we try to see the value of ML, AI, remote process automations through the network, et cetera, I have a famous quote that I like to say is just like the original Jurassic Park movie, the Jeff Goldblum character said, "You're so busy trying to see if you could do it, you never asked the question, should you do it?" Right? So I asked the question like to my teams who are putting RPAs on the network, "Hey, we're automating these things and we're letting it loose and it's doing great, scaling functions. Awesome." I said, "So did you coordinate that with our SOC to make sure that they understand that unauthenticated process is not a bot that's running around on the network?" And then they sat there and went, didn't think about that. And I'm like, so that's our challenge with new emerging technologies. They're too busy trying to get it on the network or getting it into production so that we could see the value of it. No one's bothered to understand what the impact is. Zero Trust will help us from a perspective of I can do SD-WAN, I can do microsegmentation, I can put it in a protected environment, and then we can start to understand that better while they're busy seeing the value come to realization, rather than put it out on my big network and take me down because they didn't realize what they were doing. So I see value in those technologies, both from an offensive and a defensive perspective, but we have to also think in terms of how do we protect ourselves from ourselves. And in doing so, we protect ourselves from our enemies who try to leverage it as well. Over.
Excellent. Yeah, Scott, I mean, the same question. Also, I think the Internet of Things is another thing that you have to consider with all the devices that a lot of particularly agents and individuals may have in your agency. What are your thoughts on what needs to be sort of augmented with Zero Trust and dealing with those emerging technologies?
Yeah, so Mitch brought up the Technology Modernization Fund. CBP's been fortunate enough to receive some of that TMF funding. That's been huge for us to get legacy advanced to the point where we can do some things with Zero Trust. We'll, I'm sure, be continuing to submit for TMF funding because there's a lot of legacy that we have to modernize, whether it's an application or I mentioned operational technology, things that have to be modernized before we can actually work Zero Trust for them. And then Elizabeth mentioned mainframes. I think there's probably going to be caffeine as a service. Now there's mainframe as a service. And so those are some of the things that we're working with in CBP, but everything is going as a service. And those are some of the things that within CBP, and I'm sure lots of federal agencies are leveraging, is those new technologies to be able to get out of the legacy portions. I also wanted to mention, with Aaron was talking about the different things, AI, ML, artificial intelligence, machine learning, sorry about that. We are fortunate enough within the cyber team that I've been able to build out a cyber threat intelligence and a cyber threat hunt team. And so those are things that we can use to be proactive, to synthesize what we're seeing from the advanced persistent threat, the bad actors that are out there using things. I'll use another acronym, KEV, known exploited vulnerabilities. So our team is able to see those things and integrate with blocks and indicators of compromise to scan our network to make sure that we're protected. And then we've got that cyber threat hunt team that's more proactive to deep dive across our IT enterprise to find the things that are a little more deeper rooted and a little more technically able to be exploited, but not easily found. And so those are some of the things that we're doing. Then, of course, going in the dark web and looking for things that are being spoken about, keyword searches and things like that. All of that is going to feed into that overall Zero Trust enterprise. It's not necessarily in a pillar, but those are capabilities that we're leveraging now that we want to continue to expand on to make sure that once we have the architecture in place, we've got something behind it that we can actually leverage it.
That's good. It's a great forward-looking perspective and doing it in the right order. It's encouraging to hear. Mitch, your thoughts on this?
Yeah, it's, constant change is just part of the cybersecurity fund that we all manage day in, day out. Threat landscape changes, emerging technologies occur. And we have to stay on top of that, whether at all levels, right? Quantum computing is already kind of infusing what we are thinking on security. NSM 10 came out on May 4th, and that's talking about managing the transition to quantum resistant cryptography. That won't be anything like a small task. It's going to be a huge thing that will not happen overnight, but we have to start thinking about that now. The threats kind of outlined that we've talked about here, whether it be AI, artificial intelligence, quantum, this kind of has to deal with connectivity and computing power and things like that. And there's going to be other things too that don't relate to those kind of innovations. Security is just part of a tapestry of this larger kind of human machine interaction that we all have day to day now in our lives. And, one of my old bosses used to talk about security like chess, right? The technology is the chess board and the pieces on the chessboard, but there's humans behind all of this. And as culture changes, as how people use technology changes, the threat landscape is going to change, and how people try and manipulate people into their preferences and practices being manipulated into making mistakes is going to change. And people are going to find new and creative ways to rethink and try and access what they want nefariously. And we're just going to have to keep adapting to that. So yes, there is the technology, and we got to keep looking at those policies, but we also have to be thinking about how the threat landscape and our whole community is changing. That's why culture change is so important along with it.
Yeah, well, that identifies the fact that zero trust is not a static process, that it's constantly evolving. And the challenges that we're seeing now may be even more in the future with some of these technologies. I'd be remiss if I didn't ask Aaron on his thoughts on quantum technologies. I mean, there's a debate of how close they are, but as Mitch just said, that the quantum algorithms requirement to be quantum proof or quantum resistant are already in process. And is this something that could usurp the whole security balance if we don't focus on being a step ahead in integrating our quantum technologies early on rather than wait till it's too late?
From a quantum discussion perspective, we're too myopically focused on breaking algorithms. So quantum horsepower, if you will, is the threat that we all know, and we're trying to pace ourselves to be ready for it. But I argue that quantum is a bigger threat than just the breaking of encryption and cryptography. For instance, let me give you an example. If today the kill chain for cyber attack is someone's messing with our system to find a vulnerability and be able to use that vulnerability to gain unauthorized access, and we depend on the fact that we can watch for that activity and stop that activity before they get to the crown jewels, that kind of model. But what if the poking around and assessing vulnerabilities of a system, which normally takes time, could be done in an instant, with quantum computing? Now we have no ability to stop the kill chain, and a adversary would go blip, and now they know everything about our network, and then come back, a couple of days later and be able to exploit it without us recognizing that activity has happened. That's the power of what quantum could do for us. It's that kind of threat, if we think about the realities of quantum, that really scares me a little bit. And then if you kind of look at what is happening in the world in quantum sensing and quantum networks, and start, just expanding beyond just computational horsepower, I think the threat landscape is a whole lot bigger than we realize. That's not to take the eye off the ball of our cryptography upgrades. No argument. But I also think, cryptography is not going to be one of these, it's AES 256 for the next 30 years. I think cryptography is going to become a much more fluid, almost a patching methodology, to upgrade cryptography as new threats emerge, and breaking these types of encryption. So I think the future is going to change quite a bit because of quantum. So I'm curious to watch and see how it plays out.
Yeah, well, that's good. I think all of you in your roles really have to be forward thinking, just because this technology is coming on so fast, and it's very dangerous to underestimate our adversaries, as we did with hyperkinetic involvement with some of their capabilities. So I think in terms of cybersecurity and quantum and everything we're looking at, I think one of the values of the Zero Trust initiative is, each of you said, it causes us to look within and look without too, with what we don't have and what we need. And just from that question alone, I skipped it earlier, but is there anything that you think personally that should be added or augmented to the Zero Trust mandate now that should be looked at by agencies? And I'll start, I think Mitch probably could, since you're probably looking at different levels of involvement, what goes next, could probably talk about this.
Yeah, I'm happy to be put on the spot here a little. I think when it comes to, obviously OMB makes no mistakes and we're done with our OMB. No, the reality is that, change, this is really set up to kind of think about Zero Trust over a 2-year time frame, right? It intentionally focuses on 20 steps. M2209 focuses on, maybe 24, 20, whatever it may be, number of steps that agencies should be taking between FY22 and FY24. And the plan is to learn from that implementation, have opportunities to issue new policy for a new phase sometime in the future when we learn from those lessons that we've seen over the 2-year process. Federal zero trust strategy is not supposed to be a check the box exercise. It's supposed to be getting agencies to this baseline. And, of course, there's going to be gaps and there's going to be more things to kind of address as we move forward in the future. That journey is going to continue, and we're going to kind of think through the other pieces. Like, for instance, in March, we ordered agencies to implement the secure software development framework. And we released, not too long ago, September, the M2218, which is secure software development for the supply chain, and how they'll be leveraging software producers, ensuring that the software producers that they work with are utilizing sound DevSecOps. So, that's at very least complementary and fundamental to zero trust. There's always going to be elements like that we're going to need to continue forward on.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, one thing you just brought up, which I neglected to talk about earlier, is really the supply chain. And a lot of this activity we're facing right now came through basically, breaches in the supply chain, including SolarWinds or Colonial Pipeline. All those have implications with vendors, particularly looking at the working with the federal government or with critical infrastructure. So your thoughts on, and this is not scripted or anything, but how important is securing the supply chain, and is there anything else that needs to be done outside the zero trust mandate for doing that? Obviously, knowing where your device is connected and people connected are important, but are there other elements too? And I'll go back to Scott on that.
If we didn't learn anything from the last couple Decembers, whether it's with SolarWinds or Log4j, so supply chain is very, very critical. So making sure that we have an understanding of that is going to be very, very necessary. Within DHS, there's an effort to do some certifications or some understanding of our supply chain. Of course, as the further back you peel the onion, the more information you get, but it is also a challenge to do that. One thing that I do want to add on is what Mitch was saying. First off, my cup runneth over with the zero trust getting to FY24. It's going to be a challenge. One of the things that I've been talking to the team about is we will make sure that we check the box as far as the goals to get to zero trust. It's whether or not we're checking in with a pencil or with a Sharpie. We're already leaning forward in a lot of those different areas, but it's not going to be FY24, cool, we're done. This is going to go well beyond FY24. It's going to evolve, as the group has said. Technology is going to evolve, the threat's going to evolve, including supply chain. We'll have to be continually and ever more vigilant. And the discussion of funding and do we have enough budget? Like Elizabeth said, you can never have enough budget, but we also don't want to gold plate cybersecurity where it just becomes back the dump truck full of cash up, it's all going into cyber. We need to be able to demonstrate that we're actually buying down risk and proving that what we're doing is effective. And so those things, it shouldn't just be a blank check, much as I would love one for cyber. It should be put in the right areas and focused and prioritized. And supply chain is definitely one of those areas that we need to be focusing on. I'll go back to operational technology. That's probably one of our areas that we need additional assistance, guidance, things of that nature, so that we can consider and then start defending against attacks on the operational technology side as well.
Yeah, great points. Great points. Did you want to say anything too, Aaron, on this?
It's a difficult problem when the DoD has over 300,000 vendors and suppliers that we have to kind of figure out what we want to do as far as supply chain risk management goes. What I'll say is, obviously, bill of materials is a key aspect, not only the software side, but the hardware side as well. From there, we'll leave it to our partners in the SCRIM world to look at the other aspects like, foreign influence and other types of issues. But just having the inventory is key, because now we can react better when there's an incident response. We have a better understanding of the vulnerabilities we've inherited. We have put better management plans in place. I mean, look at, from a technical debt perspective, I don't think there's a federal agency that can raise their hand and say they're 100% modern, right? So there's technical debt that needs to be managed. So that kind of gets to our point today, about zero trust is we need to ID the need in this new paradigm of zero trust, but we got to align it with the programs that own these capabilities Are they planning their upgrades? Where are they in that process? Because I don't need to duplicate money there. Let them continue their effort and understand where that is, and then find those gaps that no one's planning for that will be our Achilles heel that we need to go and figure out. Now we have the list of gaps. Which one's the highest priority, either through mission need, technical risk, supply chain risk, whatever that might be, in order to, start buying down. And just, like Scott said, you can't do it all. You can't fund it all, but you certainly can start to understand it better so that you can make better decisions.
That makes a lot of great sense. Actually, this just brought to another question that came to mind. I mean, the what you're talking about, both all of you, but Scott and Aaron, what you talked about with your specific agencies, the lessons learned, what you're doing, what's working, what's not, what your challenges are. One of the things the government has always been lacking is coordination and interagency talking about, this kind of thing, usually in intelligence world particularly. But now with this new mandate, it seems to me, and this is probably a question for both Mitch and Elizabeth, because it's really a communications question. How is OMB, taking all these lessons learned and, monitoring these agencies, bringing it together, looking where there can be improvements or where there are gaps? And that's a huge endeavor, obviously, but is this something that you're looking at right now, both Mitch and Elizabeth?
I can kick this one off.
Okay.
So yes, short answer, yes, certainly. We are kind of doing this a bunch of different ways. As I mentioned, we didn't just do one deep dive with agencies. We continued the conversation. Within our office, every single agency has a desk officer who's continuing to work with them. We've also done our continued work. We receive quarterly metrics from every single agency, and we utilize those to see how things are going around the zero trust strategy as a starting point for the conversation. So we can ask questions and come from a common standpoint of where things are on specific efforts across the federal government. In addition to that, we want to ensure that when agencies are driving forward and having successes, we're able to facilitate that and power that forward and share that, frankly. So we've set up some communities of practice. We started with one around multi-factor authentication, phishing-resistant multi-factor authentication, specifically around FIDO2 and some of the other means to WebAuth and so on, to really provide token-based or other, biometric-based, whatever it may be, for a multi-factor approach that goes beyond just using PIV and PKI, and really driving new successes and innovations out of multiple different agencies. Those agencies are initiating pilots. We brought in lots of experts to support those pilots and for them to share ideas and challenges and successes. And it's going really well. We intend to kind of utilize that model multiple times over. It's exciting. It's great to see those successes, and we hope other agencies are going to be able to learn from them as well.
Great.
Yeah, being part of the community of practice for the FIDO as an organization that wants to expand our FIDO is really useful to help learn from some of the things that our partners have done, and then expanding on that. So I work at Centers for Medicare. We are a operational division within HHS. HHS provides some of our IT services, and that as they do for our peers like Centers for Disease Control, National Institute of Health. So as we are, there's a new working group for HHS folks also to make sure that we can share what we've learned about our different zero trust journeys.
Very informative. Actually, this is we're getting near the end, but I wanted to, what I'm hearing a lot, particularly from government, is that because of zero trust, because of all these recent incursions and attacks, and because of the threat levels going on, and also with you're looking at Russian-Ukraine conflict and lessons learned there too. It seems that the CISO role has been elevated in government. I don't know if it's just my perspective of being biased, but it had always been, the CIO running IT and looking at all the issues, but it seems that the CISO role now is getting recognition. And particularly, I think zero trust is enabling this. Is that your perspective too, or am I off base on this? I'll start with, I see Scott nodding. So Scott, I'll go with you first.
I've been very fortunate. So I've been with CBP for just over 2 years now, and was first the deputy and now the CISO. And the entire time, cybersecurity has been in the forefront, not just of the CIO, but leadership from the commissioner on down. Every time I've been briefing, I'm getting support, agreement, concurrence, requests for more information. It's been very encouraging that across the organization, not just from the very senior leadership, but my boss, the CIO, his peers, people see it. And I think some of it is because of the prevalence from the private sector. People in their private lives are seeing there's risk to their personal information, and they're bringing that into their work, saying, hey, you know what, if I'm at risk here, I may be at risk at work. And if you think about it, even 5 years ago, not everybody had a smartphone. Now most people have potentially two, one personal and one work. And so they're seeing the mirror of it. And that's helping us with the education piece, the awareness piece, which is going to be critical, like I said earlier, about zero trust. So I think that the CISO role has definitely been elevated in prominence, importance, key leadership, and contribution to decisions, budgeting, and programmatics. It's been very, very encouraging.
That is really great to hear, because I think it really, talking about filling gaps and voids in government, and I think that was one of the biggest ones, because it was usually just done with requests for budget and running up IT backbone, but not so much on the threats. And I think the CISO has called attention to that. Aaron, your thoughts on that too, being a CISO of two agencies?
So what I'll say is, obviously from Clear Cohen and FISMA, the construct has been built that the CISO is a function under the CIO. But I think, as Scott eloquently put, all the leadership is focused on what does this really mean for me from a, information security perspective, a, threat perspective. Can I do my mission, which is highly connected today, if I get attacked or in a contested environment, or, from that perspective. And in the DoD, it's even more critical because we're being attacked. We are in conflict online, and they're like, can we continue doing our mission if called upon? So I get called into the secretary's office, and our secretary happens to be quite focused on cyber, which is a great thing for me, which is unique in the sense that my CIO works with me and supports me. My secretary, supports me. So I would argue that it's interesting to see, will Congress and the White House and the administration look at elevating the CISO to a more equivalent role at the senior leader perspective, like that you see the trend in industry of CISOs reporting to CEOs and boards, or is it going to remain in the construct? I don't know the answer to that, but what I am seeing is, barring that change, statutorily, CISOs are getting much more prominence in discussions about, what is their impact and influence across the government domain.
Good. And that's a good trend. We're nearing the end of the hour, and we've been fortunate to have a really, really great panel. This has really been informative for me, but I'm sure for the audience, even in big ways too. So I also wanted to personally thank all of you for being here, the panelists. Again, it was just been great. If there's any final thoughts you have, want to say, feel free to jump in. It's an open thing, and we'll be signing off just in a few minutes. Any final thoughts from anybody?
I'll just take the opportunity first to say thanks to Chuck, and thanks to the panel as well, because I always learn from the people that I'm on the panels with, the points that they have in the different perspectives. So I appreciate the time.
Okay, well, thank you everybody for being with us. It was a great panel.
Thanks for listening, and thank you to our guests, Chuck Brooks, Aaron Bishop, Scott Davis, Mitch Herckis, and Elizabeth Schweinsberg. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to Caracast, and be sure to listen to our other discussions. If you'd like more information on how Juniper Networks can assist your organization, please visit www.carasoft.com or email us at junipermarketing@carasoft.com. Thanks again for listening, and have a great day.